Hook rain hammered the road as a single father drove home, exhausted and broke. He almost ignored the old man shaking at the bus stop. But one kind decision in that storm would cost a powerful boss his job by morning. Hug, I dort Hest. If stories of kindness move your heart, like this video and subscribe to Tales of Kindness. Daniel was a single dad, living paycheck to paycheck, working under a cruel boss who never missed a chance to humiliate him, and every morning he woke up with the same heavy feeling in his chest, knowing the day ahead would test his patience, dignity, and strength. Since his wife's passing 3 years earlier, life had become a continuous balancing act between grief, responsibility, and survival. He worked long hours at a warehouse where appreciation was non-existent and mistakes, real or imagined, were punished loudly and publicly. His boss seemed to enjoy reminding him that he was replaceable, that single fathers with too many problems were a burden rather than an asset. Yet Daniel swallowed his pride every time, because at the end of each exhausting day there was one reason he never quit: his young daughter waiting for him at home. That night, the storm was ruthless. The kind that felt alive, pounding the streets with relentless rain and violent wind. The sky was pitch black, broken only by flashes of lightning that illuminated the road for a split second, before plunging it back into darkness. Visibility was dangerously low, and Daniel leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. His old car rattled with every gust of wind, the engine making unfamiliar sounds that made his stomach tighten with worry. He couldn't afford repairs, not now, not ever. Missing even a single day of work could mean unpaid bills or an empty fridge, and that thought alone kept him gripping the steering wheel with tense determination. All he wanted was to get home. His daughter was waiting, probably fighting sleep on the couch, refusing to go to bed until she heard his key in the door. She always did that. Even on nights when he was late, she would curl up with her blanket and her worn-out teddy bear, insisting she felt safer knowing her dad was close. That image played in Daniel's mind as he drove her small face, her hopeful eyes, the soft smile she gave him no matter how tired or defeated he felt. She didn't see him as a man who struggled. She saw him as her hero, and that belief carried him through days that otherwise might have broken him. As he turned onto a quieter road, the rain intensified, drumming against the car roof like a warning. Water pooled along the edges of the street, and the headlights reflected off the slick asphalt in long, blinding streaks. Daniel slowed down, careful not to skid, when something caught his eye near a lonely bus stop ahead. At first, it looked like a shadow or a piece of debris pushed by the wind, but as he got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a man standing hunched under the broken shelter, clutching a small suitcase, his coat soaked through and clinging to his thin frame. Daniel's heart skipped. His first instinct was to keep driving. He was tired, soaked in stress and afraid. What if the man was dangerous? What if stopping put him at risk? What if his car stalled, leaving him stranded in the storm with no way to get home to his daughter? These thoughts flooded his mind in seconds, each one louder than the last. He reminded himself that he had responsibilities, that he couldn't afford trouble, that life had already given him enough challenges. He tightened his grip on the wheel and drove past the bus stop, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But as the car moved forward, something inside him twisted painfully. In the rearview mirror, he saw the old man grow smaller, still standing there, rain pouring down on him without mercy. Daniel felt a familiar ache, the kind that came when he remembered his own father, who had once been left waiting for help that never came. Memories he tried to bury rose to the surface: cold nights, closed doors, people choosing convenience over compassion. His chest felt tight, and suddenly, The warmth of his daughter's hugs felt far away. He slowed the car, his foot hovering uncertainly over the brake. A quiet battle raged inside him. Fear told him to go home, to be smart, to protect what little stability he had built. Kindness whispered something else, that no one deserved to be abandoned in the storm, that a few minutes of inconvenience could mean everything to someone else. Daniel thought about the lessons he tried to teach his daughter, about doing the right thing even when it was hard, about helping others when you could. What kind of example would he be if he ignored a man in need simply because it was uncomfortable? Before he could overthink it any further, Daniel pulled over. The car rolled to a stop near the bus shelter, rain splashing up from the tires. He lowered the window, and cold air mixed with rain rushed inside, sending a chill through him. The old man looked up, startled, his eyes wide with disbelief and exhaustion. Up close, Daniel could see deep lines etched into the man's face, signs of a long life filled with unseen stories. His hands trembled, whether from cold, age, or something heavier, Daniel couldn't tell. "Sir," Daniel called out over the sound of the storm, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you need a ride?" For a moment, the old man didn't respond. He simply stared, as if trying to understand whether this was real or just another cruel trick of fate. Then his lips parted slightly, and his voice came out soft, almost fragile. He said he'd been waiting for the bus for over an hour, that it never came, that he didn't want to be a burden. There was no entitlement in his tone, no demand, only quiet hope mixed with resignation. Daniel opened the passenger door. "Please," he said, "get in. It's not safe out here." The old man hesitated, then nodded gratefully and climbed into the car, his movements slow and careful. Water dripped from his coat onto the seat, and he immediately apologized, fumbling to wipe it away with his sleeve. Daniel waved it off, starting the car again and pulling back onto the road. Inside, the small space felt warmer despite the storm outside, and for a brief moment there was silence, comfortable, respectful, human. As they drove, the old man thanked Daniel repeatedly, his voice filled with sincerity. He said not many people stopped anymore, that most were too busy or too afraid. Daniel listened, nodding, keeping his eyes on the road. Eventually, the conversation shifted gently. The old man asked about the drawing taped to the dashboard, a simple picture of a stick-figure family under a bright sun. Daniel smiled without realizing it and explained it was from his daughter, that she drew it for him so he wouldn't feel lonely at work. He spoke about her in a quiet, honest way, about how strong she was, how she tried to help him by doing small chores, how she believed everything would be okay as long as they were together. He didn't realize how much he was sharing until the words were already out, but something about the old man's calm presence made it easy. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. The old man listened intently, occasionally nodding, his gaze thoughtful. He spoke little about himself, only mentioning that he had lived a long life, that he had learned how quickly people could forget what truly mattered. As they approached the destination, a modest building illuminated by soft lights, the storm finally began to ease, the rain slowing to a gentle drizzle. Daniel pulled over, and the old man reached for the door, pausing briefly. He looked at Daniel with a small, meaningful smile and thanked him once more, not just for the ride but for the kindness. Daniel shrugged it off, embarrassed, saying anyone would have done the same, though deep down he knew that wasn't true. As the old man stepped out, he turned back one last time, his eyes meeting Daniel's. In that moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet sense of peace. He watched the man disappear into the building, then drove home, unaware that this simple act of compassion, born from an internal struggle and a stormy night, had just set in motion events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The old man thanked Daniel quietly as he got into the car. rain dripping steadily from the edges of his coat and pooling on the worn rubber mat below his feet. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't used to being heard anymore. Daniel nodded in response, offering a small, reassuring smile before pulling the door closed and easing the car back onto the road. Inside the vehicle, the sound of the storm dulled slightly, replaced by the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine struggling against the cold night. The air felt heavy, filled with the scent of wet fabric and something older, like memories that had soaked deep into the man's clothes. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Daniel focused on the road, his eyes scanning through the blurred reflections of streetlights on the wet asphalt. The old man sat upright, hands folded carefully on his lap, staring out the window as if watching the rain tell stories only he could understand. There was an unspoken understanding between them. No rush, no pressure. Just two strangers sharing a small space, brought together by chance and a single decision. Eventually, the old man broke the silence. He commented on how fierce the storm was, mentioning how weather like this reminded him of how small people truly were in the grand scheme of things. Daniel agreed, adding that nights like these made you think about what really mattered. His words came slowly at first, cautious, but something about the old man's calm presence made it easier to keep talking. The old man listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his eyes reflecting not just attention but genuine interest. As the car moved through quieter streets, Daniel found himself opening up more than he had intended. He spoke about his daughter, how she was the center of his world, how every long shift and every swallowed insult at work was for her future. He described her laughter, how it filled their small apartment, how she believed her father could fix anything even when he felt broken inside. His voice softened when he talked about her, and for the first time that night, the tightness in his chest loosened slightly. The old man listened carefully, turning his body just enough to face Daniel. His eyes were thoughtful, almost reflective, as if Daniel's words stirred something deep within him. He asked gentle questions, not probing, not intrusive, just enough to show he cared. When Daniel mentioned his struggles at work, the constant pressure, the cruel boss who seemed to thrive on belittling others, the old man's expression changed subtly. There was no shock, only understanding, as though he had seen this story unfold many times before. Daniel spoke about how hard it was to keep his head down, how some days he felt invisible, like his effort didn't matter. He admitted there were nights he sat alone after putting his daughter to bed, wondering how long he could keep going like this. Saying these things out loud felt strange, almost dangerous, but also relieving. The words flowed now, carried by the steady movement of the car and the quiet acceptance in the passenger seat. The old man responded slowly, choosing his words with care. He spoke about loss, not in detail, but with enough weight to show it was something he knew well. He mentioned that life had taken people from him too, and that grief had a way of reshaping a person, teaching lessons no one asked for. He said that sometimes the hardest part wasn't the pain itself, but learning how to live alongside it. His voice held no bitterness, only a calm wisdom that came from enduring rather than escaping. As the rain eased slightly, Daniel felt a strange sense of connection growing between them. This was not a conversation filled with grand speeches or dramatic confessions, but something quieter and deeper. Two people acknowledging life as it was, messy, unfair, and still somehow worth caring about. Daniel realized he hadn't talked like this in a long time. Not since his wife had passed away and the world had narrowed to survival mode. The old man glanced again at the drawing on the dashboard, asking about it with a faint smile. Daniel explained how his daughter loved to draw happy endings, even on hard days. He said she believed that kindness always came back to people, even if it took a long time. The old man chuckled softly at that, remarking that children often understood truths adults forgot. He said hope was a powerful thing, especially when carried by those who had every reason to give up but didn't. They drove on, the city slowly giving way to quieter neighborhoods. The old man pointed out a few familiar landmarks, mentioning how much the area had changed over the years. Daniel listened now, letting the man share fragments of his own life stories of long walks, missed opportunities, and moments of unexpected grace. Nothing specific enough to reveal who he was, but enough to show he had lived fully, with regrets and lessons carefully tucked away. When they finally reached the destination, a modest building glowing softly against the damp night, Daniel pulled the car to the curb. The storm had calmed to a light drizzle, the rain no longer angry, just persistent. The old man sat for a moment longer, as if reluctant to end the conversation. He turned to Daniel, his eyes warm and steady, and thanked him again, not hurriedly, but with intention. Daniel waved it off, saying it was nothing, that he was just glad he could help, but the old man shook his head gently, insisting that kindness was never nothing, especially when given freely. He opened the door, stepping out into the rain, his coat still damp, but his posture a little straighter than before. Before closing the door, he looked back one last time and wished Daniel well, telling him to keep being the man his daughter already believed him to be. Then he smiled a simple, knowing smile and stepped away, disappearing toward the entrance of the building. Daniel watched him go, feeling a quiet warmth settle inside him. He didn't know who the old man really was, didn't suspect that this brief encounter carried any significance beyond the moment itself. To him, it was just a ride, a conversation, a small act of decency on a hard night. As Daniel drove away, the rain tapping gently against the windshield, he felt lighter than he had in months. He didn't realize that the old man was watching from inside, his thoughtful gaze following the car until it disappeared down the street. He didn't know that the man was replaying every word of their conversation, every detail of Daniel's honesty and humility, weighing it against the many faces he had seen over the years. Daniel headed home, thinking only of his daughter and the comfort of finally reaching his small apartment. He had no idea that by morning, the quiet kindness he offered without expectation would ripple outward, exposing truths, reshaping futures, and proving that even the smallest human connection can carry consequences far beyond what either person can imagine. The next morning at work felt strange from the moment Daniel stepped through the doors, as if the air itself carried a tension he couldn't explain. The warehouse, usually loud with the clatter of machinery and sharp voices, seemed unusually hushed. Conversations dropped to whispers, and people glanced over their shoulders before speaking, their faces tight with curiosity and unease. Daniel paused near the time clock, confused, wondering if he had missed an announcement or if something had gone wrong overnight. He clocked in quietly, his senses alert, feeling like an outsider in a place he knew all too well. As he made his way to his workstation, he noticed small groups of employees clustered together, murmuring urgently. Normally, morning gossip centered on deadlines or complaints about long hours, but today the tone was different, sharper, more serious. Someone mentioned a surprise visit. Another spoke about upper management. Daniel tried to catch pieces of their conversation, but the words dissolved into fragments before he could make sense of them. He assumed it had something to do with inspections or budget cuts, things that usually meant trouble for workers like him. Then it happened. Through the large windows near the front of the building, a sleek black luxury car pulled into the parking lot, its polished surface reflecting the pale morning light. It stood out immediately against the dull, dusty vehicles that usually filled the lot. People stopped what they were doing, heads turning in unison. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. No one important ever came here unannounced, and when they did, it was rarely good news. The car door opened slowly, deliberately, and a man stepped out. At first, Daniel didn't recognize him. The man wore a tailored coat, his posture straight, his movements calm and assured. He didn't rush or look around nervously. Instead, he carried himself with quiet authority, as if he belonged anywhere he stood. As he walked toward the entrance, something tugged at Daniel's memory, a familiar shape, a familiar face. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was the old man from the storm. The same eyes, the same calm presence. Only now there was no rain-soaked coat, no trembling hands. The man looked composed, respected, powerful. Daniel's heart began to pound as disbelief washed over him. He stood frozen, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet passenger from the night before with the confident figure now walking into his workplace as if he owned it. Within moments, managers rushed toward the entrance, their expressions shifting instantly from confusion to forced politeness. Daniel had never seen them move so fast. They greeted the old man with stiff smiles and respectful nods, addressing him with titles Daniel had never heard spoken aloud in this building. The contrast was jarring. This was not a guest. This was someone they feared disappointing. The old man acknowledged them with a brief nod, his expression unreadable. He didn't waste time. He walked straight past them, his footsteps steady, and asked for a meeting room. His voice was calm but firm, carrying a weight that made people straighten instinctively. Within minutes, supervisors were summoned, department heads pulled from their offices, and phones buzzed urgently across the floor. Daniel watched from a distance, his mind racing. A cold realization settled over him, followed by a wave of nervous anticipation. He thought back to their conversation in the car, the way the old man had listened so intently, the thoughtful questions, the quiet observations. He remembered the man's knowing smile before stepping back into the rain. At the time, it had felt comforting. Now it felt ominous. Work came to a standstill. Machines were shut down. Employees were instructed to wait. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone sensed that something serious was unfolding. Daniel felt exposed, as if every word he had spoken the night before might now be echoing through the walls. He wondered if he had said too much, if honesty would somehow cost him the little security he had left. Behind closed doors, the meeting began. Though Daniel couldn't hear what was said inside, the tension outside was unbearable. Time dragged on as whispers continued to circulate. Someone mentioned audits, another mentioned complaints that had been ignored for years. Daniel's thoughts drifted to his boss, the man who had made his workdays miserable with insults and threats. He glanced toward the office where the man usually sat, noticing the door was shut tighter than usual. Eventually, raised voices could be heard through the walls, not shouting, but firm, unyielding statements, the kind that didn't invite excuses. Managers began stepping out one by one, their faces pale, avoiding eye contact. Some looked stunned, others looked guilty. Daniel had never seen authority crumble so visibly before. Then the door opened again, and the old man emerged, followed by Daniel's boss. The change in the man was shocking. The cruel confidence he usually wore like armor was gone. His shoulders slumped, his face drained of color. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the power he once flaunted so easily. Papers were clutched tightly in his hands, his jaw tense as if he were trying to hold himself together. The old man spoke calmly, his voice carrying across the open space. He addressed the room, explaining that a thorough review had taken place. Complaints had been examined. Complaints about mistreatment, abuse of authority, unethical behavior. Evidence had been presented, including recordings, written statements, and internal reports that had been buried or ignored. The words landed heavily, each one cutting through the silence. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he realized that many of those complaints mirrored his own experiences. Things he had endured quietly, things he had assumed no one cared about. The old man continued, explaining that leadership was not about control or fear, but responsibility. That power did not excuse cruelty. That workplaces built on humiliation eventually collapsed under their own weight. His tone was not angry, but resolute, as though this decision had been inevitable for a long time. When he finally announced that Daniel's boss was terminated effective immediately, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The words hung in the air, unreal and final. Before noon. Just like that, security stepped forward, not aggressively, but firmly. The former boss didn't protest. He looked around briefly, perhaps realizing for the first time how little loyalty his behavior had earned him. His eyes flicked past Daniel without recognition, and then he was escorted away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they disappeared completely. Silence followed. Daniel stood rooted in place, his hands trembling slightly. He felt a strange mix of shock, relief, and disbelief. For so long he had believed nothing would ever change, that people like him simply endured, while people like his boss thrived. And yet, here it was justice unfolding in real time, quietly but decisively. The old man's gaze moved across the room, settling briefly on Daniel. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Daniel understood. There was no triumph in the man's expression, no smug satisfaction, only quiet certainty, as if this outcome had been set in motion the moment Daniel had chosen kindness on a stormy night. The old man turned back to the managers, issuing instructions for restructuring, accountability, and support systems for employees. His words were clear, measured, and impossible to ignore. This was not a performance. This was a correction. As the meeting dispersed and people slowly returned to their stations, the atmosphere felt transformed. Lighter, uncertain, but hopeful. Daniel exhaled deeply, realizing he had been holding his breath for months, maybe years. He didn't know what would happen next, only that something fundamental had shifted. And as he resumed his work, his thoughts drifted back to the rain, the bus stop, and the quiet voice that had asked for nothing more than a ride. He finally understood that some storms pass through your life not to break you, but to reveal truths that have been hidden for far too long. Daniel was called into the office late that afternoon, long after the shock of the morning had settled into a strange, uneasy calm. A supervisor approached his workstation with an unusually polite tone, asking him to follow. Daniel's stomach tightened instantly. Nervousness crept in, cold and familiar, the kind he had felt countless times before when authority summoned him without explanation, even after everything he had witnessed, the luxury car, the firing, the dramatic shift in power. His instincts still told him to brace for the worst. Years of walking on eggshells had trained him well. As he walked down the hallway, every step felt heavier than the last. His mind raced through possibilities. Had he done something wrong? Had his words from the night before somehow crossed a line? He replayed the conversation in the car over and over, searching for anything that could be misinterpreted. He thought of his daughter again, waiting at home, trusting him to keep things together. The thought tightened his chest. He couldn't afford uncertainty. He couldn't afford mistakes. The office door stood open when he reached it. Inside, the old man sat calmly behind the desk, hands folded neatly, posture relaxed but attentive. The room felt different than it ever had before. Quieter, warmer somehow. The cruelty that once seemed embedded in those walls was gone, replaced by a stillness that made Daniel acutely aware of his own breathing. He hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to speak or wait. "Daniel," the old man said gently, looking up with a familiar expression. "Please, come in. Sit down." Daniel obeyed, his movements stiff, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Up close, the man looked older than he had in the car, his face lined with years of responsibility and reflection. But his eyes were the same clear, steady, observant. They carried no judgment, only understanding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel stared at the desk, afraid to look up, his heart pounding loud enough that he wondered if it could be heard. Then the old man leaned back slightly and broke the silence. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. Daniel looked up, confused. "Sir." "For what you did last night," the man continued. "For stopping. For listening. For helping without knowing who I was or what I could offer in return." Daniel swallowed hard. "I didn't. I mean, anyone would have done the same." The old man smiled softly, not unkindly. "You'd be surprised how often they don't." He paused, then spoke again, this time with quiet honesty. He explained who he was, not just the owner of the company, but someone who had spent years watching organizations rot from the inside because people in power were never challenged. He said he had learned that reports and audits rarely revealed the truth. People behaved differently when they believed no one important was watching. So he had started doing something unmental, showing up, unnoticed, listening, observing, testing integrity not through words but through situations. Daniel listened, stunned. The storm, the bus stop, the ride, it all took on a new weight. None of it had been random. "I didn't tell you who I was," the old man said, "because I didn't want gratitude. I wanted honesty. And you gave me that without hesitation." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't planned to be honest. It had just happened. He had spoken from exhaustion, from love for his daughter, from a place he rarely allowed anyone to see. The realization that those words mattered, that they had been heard, made his chest ache in a way that was both painful and relieving. The old man went on, explaining that Daniel's story was not unique, but his response to hardship was. He spoke about resilience, about the quiet strength it took to keep showing up, to remain kind when bitterness would have been easier. He admitted that hearing Daniel talk about his daughter, about the daily struggle to balance grief and responsibility, had confirmed suspicions he already held about the company's leadership. "You reminded me why this business exists in the first place," he said. "People forget that work is supposed to support life, not crush it." Daniel sat frozen, unsure how to respond. Praise felt foreign to him, almost uncomfortable. He was used to criticism, to being told what he lacked, never what he embodied. The old man slid a folder across the desk. "I want you to look at this," he said. Daniel hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents official, unmistakable, a promotion, a significant raise, adjusted hours that allowed him to be home for his daughter. Benefits he had never had before. Security, stability. His vision blurred as he read the words again and again, afraid they might disappear if he blinked. "I don't understand," Daniel said quietly. "I didn't do anything special." The old man shook his head. "You did something rare. You acted with integrity when no one was watching. You treated a stranger with dignity when you had every reason not to. That matters more than any qualification on paper." Daniel's hands trembled as he closed the folder. For the first time since his wife's passing, the future didn't feel like a wall he was slowly being pushed against. It felt open, possible. The old man continued speaking, explaining that this wasn't charity or a reward, but a responsibility. He believed Daniel had the character to lead with empathy, to influence the culture in ways policies never could. He wanted Daniel to help rebuild what had been damaged, to be a voice for fairness, a presence people could trust. Daniel nodded slowly, emotions flooding through him. He felt grief rise unexpectedly, tangled with relief. Thoughts of his wife filled his mind, her belief in him, her quiet encouragement during the early years when everything felt overwhelming. He imagined telling her about this moment, about how kindness had come back to them in a way neither of them could have planned. "I was scared all the time," Daniel admitted, his voice breaking. "After she died, I didn't know if I was strong enough to do this alone." The old man listened without interrupting. "I still am sometimes," Daniel continued. "But last night, I saw someone who needed help, and for a moment my fear didn't matter." The old man nodded. "Fear doesn't disappear," he said, "but hope can grow stronger." When Daniel finally stood to leave, his legs felt weak, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The office no longer felt like a place of punishment. It felt like a beginning. As he stepped back into the workspace, co-workers looked at him with curiosity and cautious optimism. Word traveled fast. Something had changed, not just for him, but for everyone. Daniel returned to his station, the folder tucked carefully under his arm, afraid to let it out of his sight. He worked the rest of the day in a daze, replaying the conversation, grounding himself in the reality of it with every breath. That evening, Daniel picked up his daughter earlier than usual. When she saw him, she ran into his arms, laughing, her worries non-existent. He held her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling something inside him finally settle. At home, over a simple dinner, he told her that things were going to be better. Not perfect, but better. He told her that sometimes doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. She listened with wide eyes, nodding seriously, as if storing the lesson away for later. That night, after she fell asleep, Daniel sat alone in the quiet apartment, the folder open on the table in front of him. Tears came then, slow and unrestrained, not from sadness, but from release. From the realization that the world had not closed its doors on him after all. For the first time since his wife's passing, fear loosened its grip. In its place, something unfamiliar, but welcome took root. That evening, Daniel hugged his daughter tighter than ever before, holding her as if the simple act of keeping her close could protect both of them from everything the world had once threatened to take away. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, laughing softly, unaware of how deeply that moment grounded him. Her warmth, her familiar scent, the steady rhythm of her breathing against his chest, all of it reminded him why he had endured so much in silence for so long. In that embrace, the noise of the past years faded, replaced by a quiet certainty he had almost forgotten was possible. They stood like that for a while, in the doorway of their small apartment, the evening light slipping in through the window, painting the walls with soft shadows. His daughter finally pulled back and looked up at him, studying his face with the seriousness only children possess. She noticed the change immediately, the way his shoulders weren't hunched anymore, the way his eyes no longer carried that constant layer of worry. She smiled, satisfied, as if she had been waiting for this version of her father to return. Dinner that night was simple, nothing special by most standards. A modest meal at a small table, the kind of dinner they had shared hundreds of times before. Yet everything felt different. Daniel listened more closely to her stories about school, laughed more easily at her jokes, and answered her questions with patience instead of distraction. He realized how often his mind had been elsewhere in the past, calculating bills, worrying about work, replaying harsh words spoken to him during the day. Tonight, he was fully present, and that alone felt like a gift. As they ate, his daughter talked about kindness in her own way, mentioning how she had shared her crayons with a classmate who forgot theirs. Daniel paused, struck by the timing. He told her she had done the right thing, that small actions mattered more than people realized. She nodded proudly, as if this was a truth she already understood. Children, he thought, carried wisdom that adults often lost while trying to survive. After dinner, they sat together on the couch. She leaned against him, flipping through a picture book she had memorized but still loved. Daniel's thoughts drifted back to the storm, to the moment he had almost driven past that bus stop. He shuddered slightly, imagining how close he had come to choosing fear over compassion. The weight of that realization settled in his chest, not as guilt, but as gratitude. Gratitude for the pause, the hesitation, the voice inside him that had said, "Stop." He thought about the old man's quiet smile, the way he had listened without judgment, the way he had stepped back into the rain without revealing the truth. Daniel understood now that kindness often arrived disguised as inconvenience, that it asked for trust without offering guarantees. He also understood that it didn't need recognition to be powerful. Sometimes its impact revealed itself much later, in ways no one could predict. Later that night, after his daughter had fallen asleep, Daniel sat alone by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. The storm had passed completely, leaving the air clean and still. He reflected on how much had changed in such a short time, not just in his circumstances, but in his outlook. For years he had believed kindness was a luxury reserved for those who had enough money, enough time, enough security. But the truth was the opposite. Kindness had carried him through his hardest moments. It had been the one thing he could always afford to give. He thought about his wife then, more vividly than he had in months. He imagined what she would have said about everything that had happened. He could almost hear her voice, gentle and steady, telling him she was proud of him, not for the promotion or the stability, but for remaining who he was, despite everything. That thought filled his eyes with tears. But this time, they didn't hurt. They felt like a release, like a conversation finally completed. Over the following days, Daniel noticed subtle changes everywhere. At work, people stood a little straighter, spoke a little more openly. Conversations that once happened in whispers now happened in the open. He carried himself differently too, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. He didn't need to prove anything. He knew who he was. He had always known deep down, but now the world reflected it back to him. At home, life grew lighter. Not perfect, but lighter. He no longer checked his bank balance with dread. He no longer lay awake at night fearing the next morning. Instead, he began planning small plans at first. A weekend outing, a new backpack for his daughter, maybe even a short trip someday. These weren't grand dreams, but they felt monumental after years of living in survival mode. What stayed with him most, though, was the lesson of the storm. How easily life could have gone another way. How one small decision, barely a moment in time, had created ripples far beyond his understanding. Daniel became more attentive to the people around him. He noticed the tired cashier at the grocery store, the neighbor who always struggled with groceries, the co-worker who looked overwhelmed but never spoke up. He didn't save everyone. He didn't fix everything. But he listened. He offered help when he could, and sometimes that was enough. He taught his daughter the same, not through lectures, but through example. She watched him hold doors open, speak kindly even when frustrated, pause when others hurried past. She absorbed these lessons quietly, weaving them into her own small world. Daniel realized that this, more than any promotion or paycheck, was the true legacy he wanted to leave her. Months later, on a calm evening much like that first one after the storm, Daniel found himself driving past the same bus stop. It looked ordinary now, unremarkable in daylight. Still, he slowed down instinctively, his heart tightening with memory. He parked briefly and sat there, reflecting. Not because he expected anything to happen, but because he wanted to remember who he had been in that moment and who he had chosen to be. He understood now that kindness didn't guarantee reward. Sometimes it led nowhere visible. Sometimes it went unnoticed entirely. But sometimes, just sometimes, it changed lives. And even when it didn't, it changed the person who gave it. It softened edges. It kept bitterness at bay. It reminded people of their shared humanity. That night, as Daniel tucked his daughter into bed, she asked him a simple question. "Daddy," she said sleepily, "do you think people are mostly good?" Daniel paused, considering everything he had seen and lived through. He smiled gently and brushed her hair back from her face. "I think people are capable of good," he answered. "Sometimes they just need a reason to remember." She seemed satisfied with that and drifted off to sleep, her breathing slow and even. Daniel sat beside her for a while longer, listening, grateful. Grateful for storms that reveal character. Grateful for choices that matter. Grateful for second chances that arrive quietly, without warning. As he turned off the light and closed the door behind him, one thought stayed with him, steady and clear. Kindness, even in a storm, never goes unnoticed. It might take time, it might travel unexpected paths, but it leaves a mark on the world and on the hearts willing enough to give it. And if this story inspired you, if it reminded you of the power of a small human moment, then take a second to pass that kindness forward. Like the video. Subscribe to Tales of Kindness. Your support helps keep stories like this alive, stories that remind us, even on the hardest days, that compassion still matters and humanity is still worth believing in. Ha!